There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
Sometimes it feels like the royal family are the soap opera we have been watching our entire lives.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
We're entering a new dawn, and what will King Charles bring to the table, really? I think people are wondering when his coronation will be.
The royal family is bracing for a new tell-all from Harry and Meghan, with a big hint today. A new docuseries will reveal what goes on behind palace doors.
I'm Holly Wainwright, and today I'm taking over No Filter for a very special interview and to talk about this very, well, let's face it, tumultuous moment in royal watching. Over the past 12 months, we've seen a literal transition of the crown as Queen Elizabeth died and King Charles stepped forward. We have seen unprecedented access to the inner workings of the royal families via Prince Harry and Meghan's TV show, book deal, podcast, bombshell interviews, and we have seen a monarchy wrestling with relevancy and identity in a world that is changing much, much faster than they are.
There's a hierarchy of the family. You know, there's leaking, but there's also planting of stories. It's a dirty game.
If you've been paying attention to the narrative around the royals, you would know that there are heroes and villains in this story, and very often journalists, particularly royal journalists, are cast as the villains. But at some points in history, they have also been chosen as the vehicles to get the royals' stories out there. The man we're talking to today is Andrew Morton. And if you have watched the most recent season of The Crown, you would have seen him as a kind of floppy-haired young reporter, being the man that Princess Diana chose to tell her story in his book, Diana, Her True Story, all the way back in the early 90s. At the time, nobody knew that Diana had given Andrew Morton screeds and screeds of tape recordings of her telling her story. When that young man put his earphones in a cafe in London and heard for the first time the name Camilla Parker Bowles, heard for the first time about the condition of bulimia nervosa, heard for the first time about what a marriage that everybody had held up as a fairy tale dream was really like from the inside, he couldn't believe that he had been chosen to tell this story. Because he wasn't a royal insider. He was a man from Leeds in the north of England, a jobbing journalist who was very much at the beginning of his career. Until Diana died, he had to go along with the narrative that she had not cooperated with that book. And it was always under question whether those stories were true. But after she passed, it all came out that, in fact, it really was her story. Now, nearly 40 years later, Morton has written more than 19 books. And a lot of them have been about the royals. He's written a biography of Prince Andrew, he's written about William and Catherine, he's written about Meghan, and his latest book is about the Queen. It's called The Queen, Her Life, and it's an in-depth, very clear-eyed but fair representation of a woman who lived an extraordinarily privileged life of duty and sacrifice, Queen Elizabeth II. So, pour yourself a cup of tea, listen to Andrew Morton taking us behind the scenes of the royal soap opera. Obviously, we're talking about your new book, The Queen, and I do feel reading it like I know her a little bit better. I mean, it's one of the most talked about and analysed women in the world, obviously. But before we talk about that, I wanted to ask you about King Charles. The week that we're talking right now is the week we're about to see, as described, a world event from Netflix of Harry and Meghan's documentary. In my mind, over in King Charles's court, they're all running around with their hair on fire, wondering how they're going to handle this and react to this. But you have been clear in interviews I've listened to you that the royals don't really panic. The Queen has always more veered to disappointment than rage when these kind of things happen. What do you think's going on in the court of King Charles this week?
Let me start from the beginning. I think that they will be watching it intently and
quite concerned about it, but not overly concerned. I'll tell you why. It's pretty thin gruel that they're selling now. They did the bombshell with the Oprah interview. Now they're coming in for seconds, and there's not much new or fresh in it. I mean, members of the royal family complain about the media. Well, that's a bit ho-hum. Members of the royal family say that there's a hierarchy in the monarchy. Well, yes, it's called the monarchy. There is a hierarchy. So if they're your best lines, if I was King Charles, I'd be quite relaxed and thinking, well, bring it on, because there's not much there to excite people. It's going to be beautifully produced and nicely packaged, but we've already had the substance through Oprah. This is the leftovers.
Do you think that this documentary event and the biography, Harry's biography, Spare, coming, is it sort of like the modern equivalent of Diana's Panorama interview and obviously her true story with you?
Do you think Mrs. Parker Bowles was a factor in the breakdown of your marriage?
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
Do you think that he is following his mother's playbook in a way?
Well, he's certainly following in his mother's playbook. He's got a ghostwriter, John Moeringer, to write his biography, just like Diana asked me to write hers. So, yes, there's certainly a comparison there. But the big difference is this. Harry is 5th in line to the throne. Diana was the future queen. And that's a big difference. When the future queen is saying that her husband, the future king, isn't fit to be king, then that's a story. When you've got 5th in line to the throne complaining about the media, that's not really a story. It's just a complaint.
I've heard you say that it's position, not popularity, that matters in the royal family, and that is a sort of misunderstanding that's read into both how Meghan felt, perhaps, or has said that she felt. I know that's true, literally true, as in William is the one who's going to be the king. But in the world where the currency is so much about social media and who can tell a salacious story and present themselves in a certain way, are they going to win the popularity war?
Well, there's no question of it that Harry and Meghan are a charismatic couple. And when Harry embraces children on a walkabout or youngsters on a walkabout, you're seeing the ghost of Diana walking.
My mum certainly made most of her decisions, if not all of them, from her heart. And I am my mother's son.
Meghan, she's very fluent, very articulate, and very focused on her position.
So much of what Meghan is and how she is so similar to my mum. She has the same compassion, she has the same empathy, she has the same confidence. She has this warmth about her.
So I'm not going to gainsay their achievements, but having said that, there's a complete misunderstanding by Meghan and, quite frankly, by Harry, that just because they bring the crowds out means to say that they should get more money, more attention, more background help or backroom help. Because I've got news for them. Every single member of the royal family has their day in the sun. And I will include Prince Andrew with that. He was once the Playboy Prince, the #1 royal pin-up in the world, the most eligible royal bachelor, and now he's in the shadows in disgrace. It is very much about position, and William's position has always been the heir. Harry's position has always been, as his book title says, the spare. And it's not a road that is easy to plot a course on. Princess Margaret was the spare. She struggled to find a role in life and dissipated a lot of her energy in just having a good time. The Queen, by contrast, her sister by contrast, was getting up and preparing to read the red boxes when Margaret was coming home from a nightclub with the mill bottles.
Yes.
So obviously the heir, King Charles, the future King William, all have a destiny that's preordained, laid down and logged, and in some ways is quite unnerving because there are certain waypoints and then you die. And for the spare, it's how do you find a role? Now, I would use the example of Princess Anne. She was a spare. At one point, she was, 3rd in line to the throne, 2nd in line to the throne, rather. But she made her own way and without fuss, without fanfare, and she took on the Save the Children Fund as patron and turned it from being a fairly parochial organisation into an international one, obviously with the help of many other people, but she nailed her colours to that particular mast.
Are you surprised when you've seen just how, I think many of us thought that maybe Harry's book and the Netflix show would kind of be puff pieces about finding your truth and those kind of things, but going with the Spare title and obviously promoting the documentary on there are leaks, there's bad blood. Are you surprised that he's gone quite so aggressive?
Well, I don't think it is particularly toxic. I mean, the point I made to you before is I think that they're struggling to find, a real memorable headline because they're insinuating things about the media. It's a dirty game, and like in any preview, you're compressing an awful lot of stuff and making all kinds of outlandish claims in order to bring people to watch it. I mean, I'll give you an example. In The Crown, there was hysteria in Britain before it started because they were talking about Prince Charles trying to get the Queen to abdicate, and John Major, the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister, both made statements saying that they'd never met with Prince Charles, now King Charles, to talk about abdication. Well, when you actually saw the show, I mean, Prince Charles came out of it remarkably well.
He did. He really did.
Good looking, forceful, kicking over the traces of hidebound tradition, 100% male testosterone, complete reversal of the kind of hysteria that gripped the media. And I would say the same with this, that I would put money on the fact that at the end of it, we're going to go, I think I knew about that.
Okay.
So I'm quite sanguine about it because, he's got to really, at the heart of this, he's got to address his brother. And I'll be interested to see if he lets the punches go in or whether he pulls his punches on his brother, because clearly that Cain and Abel dynamic is at the heart of the monarchy going forward.
There is a genuine rift there. It isn't a media beat up, is it? It definitely appears to be the choices that they're making. Yeah. And it's interesting the point you've made that is the lot, obviously, of the Heir and the Spare in many ways. One of the questions that people asked when I said I was talking to you, wanted to know the most just on William and Harry, and then obviously we'll move on, is they all said, what does he think Diana would think about that rift?
Oh, pretty straightforward. I mean, she was pretty clear with me. She said that Harry was William's backup in the nicest possible way, and I'm quoting that directly. She saw him as a wingman to William, and as I've said before, not a hitman. And she would be very upset if Harry uses his position to attack his brother.
You brought up The Crown. I have to ask you because I think, well, I know because I've watched it, obviously, that you are represented in it. An actor is playing you, and I know that you were consulted. You've said right down to the details about your daughter's wallpaper. So what did you think of this season once it's played out? Was it accurate? Did it feel very familiar to you?
The particular episode that involves me was dramatic, but it could have been even more dramatic. It was a very dramatic period in my life. And quite frankly, there's a whole series that could be made about the making of the Diana book. Obviously, they're constrained for time, and I'm not the showrunner like Peter Morgan. For me, there was too much emphasis on the Fayed family and not enough on the Windsor family. That's my own particular point of view. I thought that Elizabeth Debicki was exceptional as Diana, and when I first watched it, I was literally shaken by the nuances, by the mannerisms, by the speech patterns. It was like Diana talking again, and it was like being in the room with Diana.
Whereas I've heard a lot of disgruntlement about Charles's casting, that they thought that Dominic West was a bit of a flattering choice for him, which I think is a little mean. You said yourself it did represent him as very alpha.
Yeah, it mentions him alpha, positive, none of that prevarication that we've come to know and love about Prince Charles, whatever love means. And, that is at the heart of Prince Charles's character, or has been at the heart of Charles's character, this kind of guardian leader, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. And there's none of that in Dominic West's portrayal, which is far more progressive, forceful, sensitive. Not that King Charles is not sensitive.
For a generation who a lot of these stories are new, they would not be as familiar as somebody of, say, my age who literally lived through it, with the fact that Diana did write that book with you. Well, as in she entirely cooperated. I've heard you say that if Diana had lived, no one would ever know that. people would still have thought that she did not cooperate with that book. I always think that must have been at the time excruciating for you to have everybody saying, this isn't true, this can't be true, when you knew that every word was true. And in fact, there was probably a lot more that you couldn't say because legals, as I understand it. So is that accurate? Was it a very difficult time to see when that book first came out and people were saying that she hadn't cooperated?
Absolutely. People were saying I was a tabloid oik from Leeds. I mean, as though there's something wrong with coming from Leeds, great football team.
Absolutely.
And I've always said that a sociology student who wants to do something about class in Britain, not race, but class, should look at the way that book was described and defined by the literati of London. It was very much an attack on someone who was not one of us. And it was the fact that I was an outsider anyway that drew Diana to me, because she knew that I was not going to be complicit with the Palace or BBC or any of the other.
She could trust you because you weren't of that world.
It was a great leap of faith on her part. I mean, after all, she didn't know me particularly well. We met each other at cocktail parties over the years in, Australia, Italy and elsewhere. But I would never even think for a second that she was a friend or even an acquaintance. I always felt myself that I was somebody brought in to do a job, and that job was to write a book about her that was authentic, sensitive, and sympathetic.
And when you listened to those tapes for the first time, I have, again, read you say you'd never heard the name Camilla Parker Bowles. You'd never heard of bulimia. And you're listening to this, the most famous woman in the world, being so honest. You must have thought, what the hell have I got here? Did you?
Exactly. It's a bit like one of those, dramas where, I think that there's a drama out at the moment about somebody who's left in the room with Hitler and he's got a gun and he knows what the future is going to be. Does he shoot Hitler or does he not? I mean, it's one of those situations. But I felt very strongly that I had entered a separate universe, a parallel world. I listened to the tapes in a cafe, a working man's cafe in North London in Ruislip. I saw James Colthurst, who was the intermediary, as you've probably seen from The Crown.
Yeah, with his bicycle and his basket.
On his bicycle and falling off and being knocked off his bike, and all true. And I listened to this, and I can picture it as I'm talking to you. It was a kind of a damp, I think it was probably, let's say, a day in January or April, something like that. And the tube station was very quiet, nobody about. And I just thought, if somebody's been following James, I wonder what's going to happen to me. So I really kind of stood as far back from the edge of the line as possible.
You really did. You were worried.
Oh, yeah. And when people say, no, it's all fine. Well, let me just remind you of what happened with the Panorama people. They very quickly got paranoid and decamped down to Bournemouth to a hotel suite there to do the editing because they were so scared of being watched and followed. So it is something that happens. And when people talk about Diana being paranoid, Diana had absolutely every right to be paranoid. And, she was followed, she was watched, she was concerned about her phones being tapped. And when you consider that in the space of, 6 or 7 months, the Squidgygate tapes were released, the Camilla Gate tapes were released, tapes of Andrew and Fergie talking were released. I mean, extraordinary. No wonder the Queen was herself very concerned about what was going on with her family.
Just to loop back to the fact that obviously Diana collaborated so very tightly with you on that book. Certainly the narrative, again, generational, I'd suggest, but also that Harry has been putting out there relentlessly about the media and the evils of the media when it comes to the royals. But also what the discrediting of how Martin Bashir did get that Panorama interview. I think there's an idea that the royals would never work with journalists and would never be complicit in getting their stories out there. But of course they were and still are, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, let's not pull punches here. I mean, William and Harry had their phones tapped by a reporter on the News of the World, which led eventually to the News of the World newspaper being closed down by Rupert Murdoch, and News International paying a lot of money out to people who's all celebrities and other sports people who also had their phones tapped. So there was a pernicious culture inside British newspapers that really brought the industry down and made people very cynical about trusting newspapers again. So, if I was Harry and William, I'd have every reason to be suspicious of anybody linked to the media.
But there's been a sort of agreement and relationship over the years, certainly between, the journalists who work and follow the royals and the royals, that has always been an understanding, right? And that's one of the things that Harry is busy telling everybody is one of the evils, that you can't be in bed with these people.
Well, I think that's just so much nonsense, quite frankly. Certain journalists have a good relationship with Camilla. Certain other journalists have a good relationship with press secretaries. These things just emerge. If you're a journalist on tour with members of the royal family at cocktail parties, my technique was always to avoid the royals, because you're never going to get any stories out of them. It was always to focus on members of the household and to say, I'd love to take you out for lunch and things like that. It's called journalism. It's ridiculous. To complain about it. And most of the issues which have come about with Meghan and with Harry are down to Meghan's relationship with her father and the correspondence that they had and the way that newspapers got involved in it. But it was the bad blood between father and daughter that created an awful lot of this. And, it does make you stand back a little bit.
And I guess then the tabloids going in to do what they do, which is to dig into that and to ask the questions of the different sides. And Meghan was deeply unimpressed. Thought she would be more protected. That seems to be a large part of it.
It made me laugh in a kind of a grim way that she went for Diana's playbook from the get-go, was part of the royal family and, kept her distance from the media for best part for 10 years until she started working with me. Meghan went nuclear very quickly when there was a little bit of criticism of her. She got 6 of her friends to speak to People magazine, basically making out the positive side of Meghan. Well, when you do that, then you open yourself up to the next question is, let's have a look at these people. Let's have a look at what they're saying. So there is this sense that, she was going by a Hollywood playbook as opposed to a royal playbook.
Coming up, Andrew shares some insights about what life is like in the royal family when you're an outsider, whether that's Diana or Fergie or Meghan. And in a post-Queen world that is very rocky, will the monarchy survive? Talking about outsiders, though, and what she has been saying, she and Harry have been saying, is that she was an outsider also from another country, also race was at play. You would know better than most. I loved, for example, the part in one of the sections in your book where you describe what it's like for an outsider trying to decode the politics of going to Balmoral, for example, for a visit. And it's everything from you can't sit in that chair, and the Queen would actually quite enjoy, according to you in the Queen, sort of saying to somebody, you can't sit there, that's Queen Victoria's chair, to, what to wear, what to say, what to not complain about, how the routine of the day goes. Given how complex that system is, even for British people who've grown up with this sort of ingrained in them forever, you bring in an outsider from another country and also who is a woman of colour, which is not something that the royals have ever embraced before. Those are levels that we know are real. It's not imagined on Meghan's part that the royals didn't really know how to handle that, wouldn't you say?
Well, I think that they're from a different culture, a different country, but it's not like they turned their backs on her. And I think I make the point in the book that the Queen was particularly solicitous of her and ensured that she deputed one of her senior assistant private secretaries to educate Meghan in the work of the monarchy and the work of the Commonwealth. Took her on a couple of engagements, one of them to to Merseyside. So there was a real invitation to Meghan to join in. And the Queen herself was very pleased when Meghan said that she was going to give up her acting and go into royal service. So I think that there may have been raised eyebrows at the speed of the engagement and how forcibly Harry was very much the supplicant, terrified of losing this woman that he loved because he knew of the attention that the media would give to his girlfriend.
For sure. On the Queen, because obviously that's what your new book is about. So I wanted to read just this tiny passage because, as I say, I feel this is a kind and affectionate but very clear-eyed portrait of the Queen. I feel like I know her better from reading it. But again, I've heard you say the monarchy can survive this, the Harry-William rift, because it's survived many things. But I'm really interested in whether the affection that the Queen had, and obviously now that the Queen has passed, if that will transfer and endure with a generation who probably doesn't understand that level of privilege. And there's a little piece in one of your chapters about the Queen where you describe her morning routine. And you say, at 8 a.m, her personal maid arrives with a calling tray bearing a pot of Earl Grey tea, before running her bath to a depth of 7 inches and a temperature of 22 degrees Celsius, tested by thermometer. Her clothes are laid out, her hairdresser is waiting, and her personal piper plays beneath her windows at 9 o'clock sharp. Now, what a beautiful portrait of the way that the Queen started her days. But I imagine that there would be a lot of people who read that, and I'm sure that similar things are going on in the court of King Charles, although I don't know, and are like, these people, who are these people who have people running their baths and laying out their clothes and wearing in their shoes? It's got to stop. Do you think that with the Queen's passing, she had so much affection for her, but as the institution, are we just getting past that level of excess?
Well, it's a very, very good question, very germane to them thinking going forwards. I'm sure that they're all very much aware that Britain is in the throes of an economic downturn, a massive economic downturn. The country itself is quite unstable.
Yes.
That the passing of the Queen has merely added to that instability and sense of, chaos. And you mentioned earlier on in the interview that it feels like we're back in the 1970s. And, we've got industrial disputes. Apparently, it's going to be at least 1 million people on strike over Christmas and beyond. And then you've got this whole idea of the coronation, which, never mind pipers under balconies, the coronation is going to raise eyebrows about the cost, and at a time when, we will have come through a winter where a lot of people weren't being able to afford heating and choosing between eating and heating. So, yeah, the King has got a plate which is very full of quite difficult issues. Race, so that's for one. And we've seen everything that's happened with Lady Susan Hussey. I
imagine you were not particularly surprised by that exchange.
Not really. It just seemed to me like something, it was like the 1940s meets 2020. I mean, you could make a joke of it in the sense that how do the royal family greet people now? Have you been waiting long? Is the usual one. Where are you from? You can't say that anymore. So
need a new playbook.
The intonation and so on, and the fact that there's only 8% black faces in Buckingham Palace, and in the country at large, it's like 18%. So there's work to be done there, and I think I've made that point over the years that's one of the things that should happen, is that Buckingham Palace should be the best that Britain is in terms of race relations, in terms of all classes of society being allowed in, because class, as much as race, informs our thinking in Britain.
Very much. Probably more than I'd imagine an American audience, possibly even than an Australian audience, understands.
And I don't think American audiences quite understand the nuances of, it's the kind of shoes that somebody wears that defines where they were brought up. And in Northern Ireland, it's even worse because of the antagonism between the Catholics and Protestants. So going forward, King Charles has a full in tray. He's got the race issues to deal with. He's got the Commonwealth issues to deal with. And he's also, domestically, he's got several palaces that are being refurbished and are now half empty. What's going to happen to them? What's going to happen to Kensington Palace now that William and Catherine have moved out? Is it just going to be grace and favour housing for, former private secretaries and other high-ups, or is it going to be turned into, I don't know, an art gallery, because it's semi-public now anyway? Buckingham Palace, for example. King Charles could have a tremendous impact on that. Some of the light shows, that we saw during the Jubilee festivities could be replicated on an annual basis, so that you have concerts and things at Buckingham Palace. The gardens could be used for picnics. The staterooms used as an art galleries. I mean, one of King Charles's great virtues is he's always been a man of culture. You could call him the king of culture, that he could transform Buckingham Palace into a place which is very much used.
So he's got to walk a line, really, planning the coronation and beyond, of maintaining the monarchy as something of awe that we're all impressed with, but also that does not feel grossly extravagant when the nation's doing it so tough. That's one of his main challenges.
Absolutely. And it's always been the challenge for the monarchy, really. They've always gone down the road of hearth, home and family, which has kind of rather backfired, given the fact that the Queen's had 3 of her children divorced. The Queen always resented and bridled at the idea that she was the world's richest woman. And she much preferred this image of her going around Balmoral, switching off the lights. If it's cold, put on a sweater. The whole dog leaves cost money, that she sent Prince Charles as a youngster out looking for a lost dog lead. That's the kind of image that the late Queen wanted to project. And when her husband, Prince Philip, talked to meet the press in America and said, we might have to economise, we might have to sell our yacht.
I shall probably have to give up polo fairly soon, things like that. Inevitably, if nothing happens, we shall either have to, we may have to move into smaller premises, who knows?
It created a firestorm, and I'm sure the Queen was not best pleased by that.
You paint a picture of a woman who, despite being very even-tempered, and there was obviously a steely core to the Queen, no question. You don't live that life of duty without it. One thing I notice in the criticism that Harry and Meghan and whoever are throwing at the monarchy, they've always been very careful, at least while the Queen was alive, for it not to be aimed at her. These are decisions that are being made by the shadowy figures, the men in grey, leaks from rival houses. But how realistic is it really that the Queen, who, from your accounts, she knew everything about what was going on at all times. She loved to gossip, as you say. She knew all the business of her former staffers and the people in the social circles she moved in, that she was not 100% aware of all of the machinations of, whether William was allowed to do this and Harry was allowed to do that, that very often you'll hear Harry criticising, but he won't be aiming it at Grandma.
It's a very good point. I mean, the Queen was privy to everything, and downstairs staff used to love to pass on the gossip to her, as did the upstairs staff. And everybody was trying to curry favour with the Queen. As courts through the centuries, as has happened there. And so the Queen knew pretty well what was going on. And it was interesting that when Harry and Meghan decided to leave, she didn't kick the can down the road like she'd done in years gone by. She told her private secretary and others to work at pace to resolve this. So it shows you that she knew what was going on behind the scenes and was resolved to sort it out. All that to be said, she didn't know everything. Prince Philip's description of the firm belied the fact that it was a family corporation with warfare going on between different royal houses, not necessarily always involving the Queen. So she might be a little bit behind the 8 ball.
Do you think Harry will pull his punch on his father, or do you think he's happy to put the boot in to his dad?
Well, I mean, if he doesn't put the boot in, we'll all be disappointed, because that's what he's been suggesting, that his father said, I had a difficult childhood, so can you. That will make the book headline making. At the minute, I don't feel that there's anything that they're saying that I've not heard before.
Well, I imagine that all of the royal houses will be watching on the Thursday night. But as you say, keeping calm and carrying on, because what is there left to say? Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this conversation, and a happy coronation to King Charles.
Thank you so much to Andrew Morton for his time today and his extraordinary insight on this episode. You can buy his book, The Queen, Her Life, via the link in our show notes. The producer of No Filter is Emmeline Peterson. The executive producer is Eliza Ratliff, with sound production by Madeline Joannou. And I'm Holly Wainwright. Thank you for having me in your ears.